If you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying these stories, there's a link below to buy me a cup of coffee. This is the Chassidic Story Project with Barak Hullman, podcasting from Jerusalem, Israel. This podcast is sponsored by listeners just like you. To become a supporter of this podcast, please go to HassidicStory.com. HASIDIC story.com. You'll never know. You'll never know. You'll never know. You'll never know. Shalom Aleichem, my sweetest friends. It is my absolute pleasure and honor to be recording the stories for you again. And this week I have essentially two stories, but really many more. I'm going to start with the story of the Baal Shem Tov, and then, since it was Yud Shvat, the yahrzeit of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, and when the last Lubavitcher Rebbe took on the Nesiut, became the Rebbe of Chabad Lubavitch. So I have several stories, short stories, of the Frierdiker Rebbe and the last Lubavitcher Rebbe. But before I begin, I want to dedicate this podcast episode to the continued success of our soldiers in battle wherever they are, Bezrat Hashem, the returning of all the hostages, healthy and alive, the refuah shlema, the full recovery of everybody who's been injured or who is ill, the comforting of those that lost loved ones, and the continued unity of the Jewish people here in the land of Israel and all around the world, God willing. Everybody knows that, of course, the Baal Shem Tov lived in Mezhibuz, which is now in Ukraine. And in the Jewish community of Mezhibuz, there was one wealthy Jew whose name was Moshe Shlomo. And the Baal Shem Tov always knew that he could rely on Moshe Shlomo for whatever he needed when it came to money. Let's say, God forbid, a family was imprisoned for not paying their rent, or someone lost their business or home because of a fire. The first person that the Baal Shem Tov would go to was Moshe Shlomo. His generosity was so well known that even the wealthy community members, if they needed help, or they needed help for helping someone else, would always go to Moshe Shlomo. And despite his incredible generosity, Moshe Shlomo and his wife Rivka carried a deep personal pain. You see, my friends, they had been married for 15 years, and they had no children. Rivka actually had never gotten pregnant even once in all that time. And in their community, where large families were the norm, being childless caused them constant heartache. And the Chassidim would often say to one another, how is it that Hashem denies this righteous couple the blessing of children when they're so kind and generous? Why are their prayers not answered above? And of course, the Baal Shem Tov, being the leader of the community in Mezhibuz, was well aware of their pain. And when people would bring up the topic with the Rebbe and say, Rebbe, why don't you bless Moshe Shlomo and Rivka that they should have children? The Baal Shem Tov would simply nod and change the subject, as if he knew something that others didn't. Now Rivka was not a person to be defeated by the Yetzer Hara, by the evil inclination, and she wouldn't allow herself to become depressed or sad. While she deeply wanted children, she decided to take her maternal instincts and put them into caring for others. She would cook extra food for poor families, she would mend the clothes of orphans, and many times be a listening ear for anyone in need. And of course, Moshe Shlomo supported her completely, understanding that just because they couldn't have children doesn't mean that they can't love and care for the people in their community. In one particularly cold winter morning, the Baal Shem Tov sends his assistant to bring Moshe Shlomo and Rivka to his home. And the Baal Shem Tov looks at the two of them, and he can see clearly on their faces that despite their wealth and their generosity and their care for others, there was a great hole in their heart from not having children. So the Baal Shem Tov says, why are you two so sad? Look at everything Hashem has given you. Health, wealth, the ability to help others. You have so much. But the two of them had tears in their eyes, and they said, Rebbe, we're getting older. Who's going to inherit all this money that we work so hard for? Who's going to even remember us when we leave this world? And now, of course, you have to remember that in those days, people didn't live very long beyond 50 years. So let's say they get married in their early 20s or their late teens, and now it's been 15 years. They're really looking at the end of their lives and saying, Ma yeh, what's going to be? And the Baal Shem Tov said, you know what? Let's go on a journey. And he says to his assistant, tell Alexei to get 3 wagons ready. And the Chassidim were shocked. They're going on a trip in the middle of winter. But within an hour, the wagons were ready. The Baal Shem Tov was in one wagon, 10 Chassidim in another, and Moshe and Rivka in the third. And for 5 days they traveled, stopping at Jewish inns along the way. Despite the cold and his personal pain, every stop they made, Moshe Shlomo and Rivka gave tzedakah, helping everyone they could along the way. And now listen to this, my sweetest friends. They stopped in a small town near Brody. And the Baal Shem Tov got out of his wagon and told everyone else to come with him. And as they're walking through the small town, all the streets seemed very ordinary. Narrow streets, simple homes, and children playing in the snow. But something unusual became apparent very quickly. The Baal Shem Tov went over to one of the boys, and he says, "My sweetest son, what's your name?" And the boy says, "Baruch Moshe." And then the second boy who was playing with him, he said, "My name is also Baruch Moshe." And then the Baal Shem Tov turned to 3 other boys, and they all said, "Our names are all Baruch Moshe." And the 6th boy, his name was Baruch Eliyahu. And when they got to the 8th, his name was Moshe Mordechai. And then they saw a little girl, and she said, "And I'm Brachalea." Moshe Shlomo and Rivka were looking at the Baal Shem Tov, very confused that all of these children who were not related to one another would all be called Baruch Moshe, or there was some variation of Baruch or Moshe. The Chassidim were also confused. The Baal Shem Tov, however, was just smiling and continued walking. And as they went into cheder after cheder, girls' school after girls' school, in the local yeshiva, everywhere they went, the same names repeated themselves. One classroom had 6 Baruch Moshes, and all kinds of variations on the name. Another had more, and all the girls were called Brachalea, or some variation of that. After walking around for quite a long time, it was time to daven mincha, the afternoon prayer, and everyone on this little journey of the Baal Shem Tov was thoroughly confused. After davening, the Baal Shem Tov approaches an elderly man, sitting alone on a bench in the shul, learning from a Gemara, and it was clear that this man knew many stories that nobody alive knew anymore, and had accumulated a wisdom that only living so many years could give you. Now, as I mentioned before, my friends, people didn't live so long back then. There wasn't medical care like we have today. There wasn't food security, meaning actual food, or clean water. There was also the threat of the Goyim, who many times would murder Jews. We sometimes take for granted how good our life is today. And so to have an old Jew in those days was pretty rare. Of course, there was always somebody who lived to 100 years old, but it was incredibly rare. So the Baal Shem Tov goes to this elderly man, and he says, "Tell me, my sweetest friend, why is every child in this town named after Baruch Moshe?" And the old man's eyes lit up. He had been waiting a long time for somebody to ask him this question. And he said, "Everybody sit down." Tells all the Chassidim and Moshe Shlomo and Rivka and the Rebbe, sit down, I'll tell you a story." Said it was about 100 years ago. And there was a man in this town named Yitzchak Shlomo. And he was a butcher. That was his profession. But he was more than a butcher. He was actually a very compassionate Jew. Every Friday, without fail, he would always send meat to the rabbi in the local yeshiva. And the poor in this town never went hungry. They knew they could always trust Yitzchak Shlomo to feed them. And Yitzchak Shlomo and his wife waited 15 years for a child to be born. And when their son, Baruch Shlomo, was finally born, they decided he was going to be a great scholar. And they were going to put all of their wealth into training him with the finest teachers. But it was clear from the very first day of cheder that Baruch Shlomo was not meant for learning Torah. Despite hiring the best teachers and spending a fortune on private tutors, Baruch Shlomo couldn't remember any Torah that he learned. Anything. It was as if his mind was made of straw and everything simply slid off of it. After his bar mitzvah, Yitzchak Shlomo realized that his son was not going to become the scholar that he had hoped for. But instead of being disappointed, he did what I hope every parent will do for their children. He brought Baruch Shlomo into the family butcher shop. And here, a miracle happened. The same boy that couldn't learn a single Mishnah turned out to be a genius in business. And not only did he know how to pick the right animals for shechita, for slaughter, somehow having a prophetic eye and knowing which animals would be kosher after slaughter and which would not. Because of course, if you bought an animal that there, for example, was a hole in the lung, it wasn't kosher, and you couldn't even sell it to goyim. You simply lost your money. But every animal that Baruch Shlomo picked out turned out to be kosher. And he was very honest. He always checked his scales. He treated all of his customers with respect. And of course, he continued his father's tradition of supporting the community. And so Yitzchak Shlomo started spending more and more time learning Torah. knowing confidently that he could leave the entire business to his son, Baruch Shlomo. And Baruch Shlomo married a wonderful Eshet Chayil, whose name was Bracha Leah. But just like his parents, the couple remained childless. And after many years, Yitzchak Shlomo and his wife passed away. And for a reason that wasn't clear to anybody at the time, Baruch Shlomo, after his father passed away, decided to go by Baruch Moshe instead. It could be that because for him it was such a tragedy that his parents had passed away and he wanted to change his name, or there could be a deeper meaning. But now he went by Baruch Moshe, and he had a deep desire to honor his father's memory. He knew his father always wanted him to be a great scholar, so he decided to hire the best tutors and tried to learn Mishnayot. But just like in his childhood, nothing would stay in his head. And it made him frustrated because he was a very respected person in the community. He was very wealthy, but he felt inadequate. He would sit in the Beit Midrash and barely understand what his teachers were telling him. And then one day everything changed for Baruch Moshe. During a lesson on Ein Yaakov, a compilation of all the non-legal sections of the Talmud, which would make sense. That's why Baruch Moshe was sitting in the class on Ein Yaakov, rather than a class in halacha or some Talmudic discussion, because Ein Yaakov focuses on the stories and ethical teachings of the Talmud. And so while he's in the lesson on Ein Yaakov, he hears the Melamed teach something that was profound. He said, whoever teaches Torah to another child is considered as if they had given birth to that child themselves. And for Baruch Moshe, this was an earthquake. Here he was, unable to have children of his own and unable to learn Torah. And here he learns that if he teaches another child Torah, it's as if they had given birth to that child themselves. But of course he couldn't teach Torah because he didn't know enough. But the Melamed saw that something was happening with Baruch Moshe. And he explained further, he said, teaching Torah isn't just about a person actually teaching Torah, but supporting Torah education, hiring teachers for poor children, funding the chederim and the yeshivot. This is also a form of teaching. And Baruch Moshe came home to his wife Bracha Leah, and he said, that's it. Our life has changed. We now know what we're supposed to do. Hashem gave us wealth, and so we're going to use it to support every poor child who wants to learn Torah. They hired melamdim, they funded the cheders, they supported the local yeshiva, and every coin that came from their successful butcher business went into Torah education. And there were so many children that would never have learned a single letter of Torah if it wasn't for Baruch Moshe and Bracha Leah, that later became great scholars themselves. Baruch Moshe and Bracha Leah would visit all the schools. They went out of their way to have a relationship with all the students that they supported. They would help their families, and they would help them. And for them, it was kind of a different way of being a parent. And this elderly man is speaking, and he says when they passed away 15 years ago, they divided their fortune into 4 parts. 1 part for relatives, 1 for the poor, the other for the schools, and the last for tzedakah causes in the community. And it's true that they had no biological children, but they had hundreds of spiritual children. And that's why every parent in this town named their children after them. And every year, we gather in shul and say Kaddish for them. And he said they're more than parents to us. They gave us the Torah itself. And the Baal Shem Tov turns to Moshe Shlomo and Rivka, and he quotes from Yeshayahu, V'natati lehem beveiti uvechomotai yad v'shem tov mebanim umibanot. I will give them in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. Shem olam eten lo asher lo yikaret. An eternal name that will never be cut off. The Baal Shem Tov explained, my house, Veiti, means the place where Torah is studied, where Hashem's spirit rests. And within my walls refers to the Jewish people that believe in Hashem, Hashem's fortress that can never be conquered. The Baal Shem Tov said Jews like you, Moshe Shlomo and Rivka, who live by Torah and help others study it, deserve an eternal share in the Torah and amongst the Jewish people. And Moshe Shlomo and Rivka left the town of Brody completely transformed. They began dedicating themselves to supporting education with a newfound energy. In Mezhibuz and the surrounding communities, they became known for establishing cheders, giving scholarships to poor children, and making sure every Jewish child had the opportunity to learn. Rivka focused on girls' education, while Moshe Shlomo used his connections to raise funds and support the struggling schools. And they didn't just donate money, they became personally involved, visiting the schools, supporting the teachers and their families, and celebrating with each child as they grew in Torah and mitzvot. And eventually they understood why Baruch Shlomo had changed his name to Baruch Moshe. Because of course Moshe was the one that received the Torah from Hashem, and Baruch Moshe wanted to give the blessing of Torah to everyone. Years later, when the Heilige Baal Shem Tov would pass through Meshibuz, he would see smiling children that were named after Moshe Shlomo and Rivka, and he knew that it was a living testament that immortality doesn't come always through having children, but it can also come through the eternal light of the Torah and helping others to come closer to it. Shomer, Shomer Yisrael, Shemo Sherit Yisrael, Yan Yovan Yisrael, Yan Yovan Yisrael, Yan Yovan So I have some more stories for you. Everybody knows that Rabbi Yoel Kahn, of blessed memory, was one of the official chozrim, the reviewers of the Rebbe's Farbrengens, which meant that he would memorize the Farbrengens that were told in Shabbos and Yom Tov, and afterwards he would sit with other chozrim and they would write down what they remembered. Then they would bring the Rebbe's talks to the Rebbe, who would review them, and they would be published. He remembers the days in 1950 when the previous Rebbe had passed away, and everyone was longing for the Rebbe and trying to figure out who his successor would be. And during the initial period following the passing of the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, many people said that they witnessed open miracles done under the new Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. But as far as the Ramash, as he was called before he became the Rebbe, was concerned, any miracles that anybody saw were not in his merit, but in the merit of his father-in-law, which showed the Rebbe's humility and submission to the former Rebbe's authority. One miracle stood out, which was obvious to everyone. There was a student in the Chabad yeshiva who was friendly with a young man who had once learned in the yeshiva but went off the derech, as we say today, abandoning Torah observance. And as it happens, when somebody leaves the path of Torah, they also want to put down people that are still Torah Jews and in yeshiva, and he considered himself the enlightened one. It was the summer of 1950, and the Korean War was on the horizon, and this young man became concerned that he would be drafted. And since he didn't have any way to get out of the draft, he went to his friend, who was still studying in the Chabad yeshiva, and asked him what he suggested. So the friend said, "Why don't you go to the new Rebbe and ask for a blessing?" And this man practically spit when he said, "Are you joking? What's the Rebbe going to be able to do about that?" And then he said, "The new Rebbe can't do anything, and the old Rebbe couldn't do anything." But the friend insisted, and eventually this young man went and met the Rebbe. In those days, there wasn't any formal arrangement for yechidus, for a private audience with the Rebbe. Whoever wanted to speak with the new Rebbe would simply knock on the door and walk in. And so this man knocked on the door and went in. And a short while later, he comes out with a smirk on his face, telling his friend, "You see, I was right all along. I knew the Rebbe couldn't help me." And the friend said, "Did you go to the mikveh today?" And the other guy said, "No." And he said, "How can you go in front of the Rebbe without going to the mikveh? Go to the mikveh and knock on the Rebbe's door again." So he figured he didn't want to be drafted. If it meant going to the mikveh, he would go to the mikveh. And then the Rebbe took him in, and this time it was very different. When the man came out, his friends are waiting for him. And they said, "No, what happened this time?" So he said, "The Rebbe told me," quoting Pirkei Avot, "one who accepts upon himself the yoke of Torah is exempt from the yoke of government duties and the yoke of worldly cares. Therefore, you have to take upon yourself to learn a page of Gemara every day." When the Rebbe asked him, "What are you planning on saying when you get drafted to the medical board?" So the man said, "Well, I once heard from my parents that I suffered from some heart problems when I was born, so I'm thinking of complaining about heart pain." And the Rebbe shook his head and he said, "No, that's not a good idea." And then the man said, "Well, both my parents had eye problems. Maybe there's something hereditary." And the Rebbe said, "No, that's also not a good idea." And so it went. Everything the young man suggested, the Rebbe said no. And finally the Rebbe said to him, "Have you ever had problems with your teeth?" And the man says no. And the Rebbe says, "What about your parents or your grandparents? Did any of them have problems with their teeth?" And the man shook his head and said no. In that case, the Rebbe said, "You should complain about your teeth." and that was it. But when the man reached the draft office and he complained about his teeth, he received a full exemption from being drafted. It was clear to everyone that that was not because of his teeth. A few days later, one of the secretaries of the Rebbe, Rabbi Nissan Mindel, said what the Rebbe had told him. The Rebbe said, "We literally see how the Rebbe, my father-in-law, is with us in a manner that's greater during his lifetime, and we're witnessing open miracles on his part, much greater than we witnessed before his passing." Here, for example, was a young man who wanted to be exempt from the military, and he complained about tooth pain, something totally irrelevant from him, and he received a full exemption. Here's another story that took place a few months after the passing of the Rebbe Rayatz. In the summer of 1950, before the Ramash, the last Rebbe, accepted the mantle of Chabad leadership, there was a Jew who was very distant from Torah observance and completely not religious that lived in Williamsburg. And he found himself in a real problem. His daughter was very ill and she was rushed to the hospital. And the secular Jew's wife, who had distant Chassidic relatives, told him there's a tzaddik who can give blessings. And when he gives blessings, his blessings are fulfilled. Maybe you can go to a tzaddik and ask for a blessing. And the man didn't understand this concept of a tzaddik. He thought it was a type of magician. And he went to several Chassidic Rebbes, many of them Holocaust survivors living in New York. And he offered each of them $10,000, which was probably the equivalent of $250,000 today. He offered them this money if they would clearly give him a promise that his daughter would recover. But although the Rebbes wanted the money for the yeshivot, they couldn't make that type of blessing. In desperation, one Motzei Shabbos, the man goes to 770 Eastern Parkway, Chabad headquarters, and inside the congregation was finishing Arvit, the evening prayer after Shabbos. And the man ran in and he was looking for the Rebbe. But somebody said, "You have to talk with the Rebbe's secretary first, Rabbi Chadakov." So the man runs to the secretary and he says he'll approach the Rebbe after Havdalah and ask if it's possible to let the man speak with the Rebbe then and there. And following Havdalah, Rabbi Chadakov went to the Rebbe, who had already gone into his office. And when the secretary came out, he told the man, "You can't go in now. You can come tomorrow morning." Now the man's eyes filled with tears, and he said, "What do you mean, wait until the morning? My daughter is dangerously ill. By tomorrow morning, she might be gone, God forbid." And Rabbi Chadakov said, "Either way, if you believe in the Rebbe, you can rely on what he says. And if you don't believe in the Rebbe, then what are you wasting your time here?" In the morning, the man phoned the hospital and asked to speak to the doctors. And one of them got on the phone and said something very unusual has happened. Normally, this type of illness doesn't stay the same. Either things get worse or they get better. But in the case of your daughter, for 12 hours, her condition has been exactly the same. And the man made a calculation, and he had been at 770 for exactly 12 hours. So it was the morning, and he went to the secretary, and the secretary led him into the Rebbe, and the Rebbe turns to him and says, "The heavens are waiting for you, sir. It all depends on you. If you wish your daughter to recover, you have to accept 3 things upon yourself: Shabbos, Tefillin, and Kashrus." And the man said, "Rebbe, I'm not a religious person. I don't think that's possible. That's a lot to accept. Can I give the Rebbe more money instead?" And the Rebbe shook his head. "This isn't a negotiation with me. I'm simply telling you what they're saying in heaven." And so the man agreed. And then he said to the Rebbe, "But I don't know how to put on tefillin." And the Rebbe smiled and he said, "Don't worry, the yeshiva students will show you." And sure enough, the man arrived every day at 770, where one of the Chassidim put tefillin on him until he learned to do it himself. In the meantime, the Rebbe warned the Chabad administration not to take even $1 from this man. He did not want this man to think that his daughter's recovery came because of money, but rather as a result of the 3 things that he had accepted upon himself. And in autumn, during Shabbat Vayigash, the man had a kiddush at 770, Sudato Da'ah, a Thanksgiving meal, in honor of his daughter's recovery, and the Rebbe was there. And this man's name was Yehuda Leib. The Rebbe turned to him at the beginning of the Farbrengen and recited the verse, Vayigash alav Yehuda, and then Yehuda approached him. The Rebbe chose this verse specifically because it symbolized Yehuda Leib's own approaching moment, the time when he set aside his initial skepticism and fully embraced a life of Torah and mitzvot. Just like the biblical Yehuda, who had a complete change of direction when he approached Yosef, so too it was with Yehuda Leib. I have one more story about the Frierdiker Rebbe and the last Lubavitcher Rebbe. This was told by Rabbi Shalom Ber Eichhorn, who merited to serve as the previous Rebbe's attendant. He said during all the years that he attended to the Rebbe, he didn't recall even one time when the current Rebbe opened his mouth or spoke or asked something of his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe. The Ramash, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, would sit in front of the Rayatz, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, with such humility, it was like a servant before his master. Whenever the Ramash needed to see his father-in-law, even though he went in every day, Rabbi Shalom Ber said, he would witness how the last Lubavitcher Rebbe would prepare himself and wait in the hallway as if he had never met the former Rebbe before. Usually, after the Rebbe Rayatz would finish a Farbrengen, the son-in-law would stand up first and accompany him out of the hall. But one time the Rayatz concluded the Farbrengen and prepared to leave, and everybody stood up, except the Ramash, who remained seated and wouldn't move from his place. And Reb Shalom Ber couldn't understand what was going on. It was only afterwards that he realized that one of the legs of the table that the Rebbe was sitting at had fallen off during the Farbrengen. The Rebbe, who didn't want his father-in-law's Farbrengen to be disturbed, held up the table with his own leg through the entire Farbrengen so that no one would notice the table was broken. This was something that required supernatural strength. Only after everybody left did the Ramash remove his leg, and the entire table collapsed. Thank you so much for listening. As always, my sweetest friends, thank you to all the lovely, sweet supporters. It's thanks to you that I can continue to tell these stories. And thank you to all the listeners. The numbers grow, mamish, every week. More and more people are listening. And I just want to thank you for listening. And thank you for your sweet comments and all of your support. I give my whole heart to this podcast, my friends, and I feel the love back. And I just want to thank you for that. So I hope you have a beautiful Shabbos and a beautiful week. And until next week, my sweetest friends, take care of yourselves and sei gesund.